Hello, good to see you. Hello, good to see you. Good to see you. It's got to be quick. I've got to go. Thank you. Good evening, everybody. I don't think there can be a political issue around which there has been so much dishonesty, and a dishonesty that's been going on for decades, than Britain's relationship with Europe. The older ones of you in the audience will remember what it was called 40 years ago. The common market. That's right. It was just going to be about trade. No threat to British sovereignty. No threat to us running our own country. And don't worry your poor little heads. And that was the first and the biggest lie. We were taken into something on a completely false premise. And those lies have continued year after year after year, until we got to the point in the mid-1990s where public disquiet on this issue was so great, they found another method of fobbing us off. Blair started it, and what they did was to promise us, if we win the election, you will get a referendum. And we've been promised referendums at every general election since 1997. Well, at last, they are going to have to keep that promise. We are going to get a referendum between now and the end of 2017, and if we hadn't been here, it would not have happened. And I genuinely believe that this referendum is the biggest political decision any of us in this room will take in our lifetimes. This is the opportunity of a lifetime to reverse something that frankly has become a wrong. Nobody in their right minds could possibly have objected to the French and Germans in the 1950s sitting round the table and breaking bread with each other. Rather better than bashing hell out of each other once every 25 years in warfare. So the idea that a Europe would come together after World War II, where people would talk together, people would trade together, people would cooperate together, I don't think anybody in the room or anybody in their right minds would have thought that that was a bad idea. But actually, just as the people of this country have been lied to, the people across the rest of Europe have been lied to as well. Because when the French had a referendum 10 years ago on a European constitution, they said no. When the Dutch had a referendum on a European constitution, they said no. And actually, meetings like this, folks, aren't just happening in Leeds, aren't just happening in England, aren't just happening in the UK, they're happening in the north, the south, and the east, and the west of the European Union as the peoples of Europe come together to say, we don't want this. We don't want this. Nobody has ever authorized us having a new flag, a new anthem, which, by the way, when it plays in the European Parliament, I refuse to stand up for. And you know, if any of you here have come in under the false premise thinking that we hate Europe, we don't hate Europe. We love Europe. We love the continent of Europe. We love the diversity of its peoples, but we want Britain to govern itself. That's the point. Now, as this referendum campaign develops, we will see the leaders of the Conservative Party, the leaders of what's left of the Liberal Democrats. We'll see the leader of the Labour Party, though I'm not sure who it's actually going to be by the end of this week. But what we'll see, I don't know, I must have done something good in a previous life to be as lucky to have Jeremy Corbyn now as leader of the Labour Party, is all I can say. But we'll see big politics lined up, and we'll see it lined up with big multinational businesses. And what they will try to do is they will try to frighten the life out of you. They will try to tell you that if we weren't members of this European club, they wouldn't buy our widgets. They wouldn't trade with us. That millions of British people would lose their jobs and we'd all finish up living in caves if it wasn't for the wonders of Brussels. Now, our job, rubbish, I agree, sir. Louder next time, please. Rubbish, good. It is complete and utter rubbish. We are living in a modern global economy. Governments don't do business. People like you do business. All of you buy products that are manufactured in this country and across the rest of the world. You buy those products because you trust the product and you think the price is right. So we get this tosh said to us that all the car factories in Britain would close down because they manufacture cars to sell into Europe. Well, we now sell more cars overseas, outside the European Union, than we sell inside the European Union. But you might have noticed that most of the cars that we manufacture here and we sell in Europe are relatively cheap motor cars. Have you noticed which cars we import from Europe? Quite a lot of Mercedes, aren't there? Quite a lot of BMWs, quite a lot of Audis. Actually, they sell us 800,000 cars a year, more than we sell them. Does anybody seriously think that when Britain says we don't want to be part of a political union, that the boss of Mercedes will say, well, in that case, we won't sell our cars in Leeds anymore? I mean, it just is ludicrous, isn't it? It just is ludicrous. But the point about EU membership is, far from it being good for trade, actually what it's doing, folks, it's holding us back. Now, why do I say that? We are the 5th or 6th biggest economy in the world, depends which measure you look at. But we are a major, major country. And yet, as members of this European Union, we are forbidden, we are banned from making our own trade deals with any other part of the world. That is done for us on our behalf by an unelected European Commissioner. And I first really, quite a rude comment, stage left, I'll ignore it, but I'm sure it was rather funny. I first really got this. I first understood the mentality of this last year when Nick Clegg challenged me to those 2 one-hour debates. And I'm very, very grateful to Nick for doing that, because it's some of the best publicity we'd ever got. But Nick was saying that Britain just isn't big enough. Britain isn't big enough on the world stage to negotiate her own trade deals. We needed to be part of a bigger club. And only by being part of that bigger club would we have clout on the world stage. And I responded by saying, look, Nick, Iceland, with a population of less than 1/3 have just negotiated their own trade deal with China. I said, if Iceland's big enough to negotiate her own trade deals, I'm damn certain Britain is big enough to negotiate her own trade deals. But then something struck me. Something far more fundamental was what Clegg was really representing. And it's something, I think, that almost the entire British political class have felt since the Suez Crisis in the 1950s. They saw a country that had been a great country that had lost an empire. They felt that basically we were finished as a nation and we had to sign ourselves up to this European club. And I said to Nick, at that moment, in that debate, I said, but the truth is, Nick, you just don't think we're good enough, do you? And that's the truth, folks. Our leaders no longer believe that we are good enough to make our own laws in our own parliament. They don't believe we're good enough. They don't believe we're good enough to negotiate our own trade deals. They don't believe we're good enough and strong enough to control our own borders. And the message that must ring out from this meeting and must ring out through the whole referendum campaign is, let them be as negative as they want to be. We are going to be positive. We believe in Britain, and we believe we are good enough to run our own country. And it's about Britain's place in the world. You know, all this rubbish about clout that Clegg talks about influence that we hear from the Foreign Office. Do you know what we've done? And I think that I'd be very interested to hear what you think. What we've done is we've turned our backs on a group of countries who you might have seen met in Valletta, in Malta, last week. The Queen was there. Not sure whether Corbyn approved of it, but never mind. And the Queen was there, and there were 54 countries there that make up the Commonwealth. Countries that are our friends in the world, and countries that we've turned our backs on. I want us to trade with Europe and cooperate with Europe, but let's open ourselves up to a bigger, newer, far more exciting world, and let's re-establish our links with our own kith and kin and our friends, and there are 2 billion of them in the Commonwealth. In the end, however much they try to scare us, however much they try to deceive us, this European project has moved a very long way from that common market that I guess some of you in this room voted for 40 years ago. My mum and dad voted for the common market. They will both vote for us now to leave the European Union. Because really, what we're talking about a new country. The European Union's law has supremacy over our parliament. The European Union's courts have supremacy over our own Supreme Court. And I said earlier, they have a flag, they have an anthem, they have a police force, they now want to have a European army. At the end of the day, what this referendum is really all about is who we are as a people. To whom do we feel that we owe allegiance? So let's try and get a bit of audience participation, shall we? Let me show you an image. Do you owe allegiance to this flag? No? Gosh, they will be disappointed in Downing Street, won't they? Or do you owe allegiance to a different flag? And if people say to you, isn't this referendum terribly complicated? No, it isn't, folks. It's about whether we want to be a self-governing, independent, proud nation that governs itself and calls itself British, or an offshoot of Brussels. That is what this referendum is all about. So to me, the democratic argument is clear. The democratic argument is absolutely clear. The only people that should make our laws should be the men and women we send to Westminster, and we should every 4 or 5 years have the chance to get rid of them and to replace them with somebody completely different. That is what parliamentary democracy is. And if you think about it, it is that very principle that those that went before us went to war and made great sacrifice to defend. And I want it back for this country now, today. The democratic case is clear. The economic case, I mean, what on earth are we doing? What on earth are we doing? Paying £55 million a day into a club whose accounts have not been signed off by the auditors for 20 years in a row. And given that they sell us £50 billion worth of goods more every year than we sell them, all those German motor cars I talked about, they should be paying us really to be in it, shouldn't they? And not the other way round. We don't need to pay this membership fee. We can go on trading, regardless whether we're in this club or not. But the issue, above identity, but in terms of policy, the issue that I think can win the no side this referendum is the issue that our political class have tried to brush under the carpet now for several decades. And whenever anybody dares to stand up, to talk about the shape and balance of our communities, to talk about what uncontrolled mass immigration has done to people's wages, has done to our health service, has done to our housing crisis, has done to our chronic shortage of provision of primary school places, whenever anybody stands up and dares to make a reasoned, sensible argument about controlling our borders, they are shouted down and abused. And I know more about this than almost anybody. It simply doesn't make sense for the British passport effectively now to be the passport of nearly 500 million people, any of whom at will can come into this country, who can on day one qualify for all the range of social security benefits for which many of you as families have actually paid in for generations to get back what is due to you. That simply can't make sense. But I now believe that this debate about controlling borders isn't just about numbers, important though those numbers are. You know, the figures, Dave, of course, our Prime Minister, told us he would reduce immigration, do you remember, to tens of thousands a year. Well, the official figures last week showed that net migration is running at over 1/3 of a million people every year. But he can't make those promises because we have absolutely no control. So taking back control of our borders, we can only do that by leaving the European Union. And when we've done that, let's put in place an Australian-style point system so that we can choose who comes to live and work and settle in Britain. But I think that argument about numbers, that argument about economics, even that now, I think, has been superseded by one of the gravest security threats that we've faced now for many, many decades. This is something that I have tried to make part of the national debate in this country, and I've struggled to do so. Let me just show you what I said back in April and May this year in the European Parliament.
Four years ago, I stood here and said that bombing Libya would be a huge mistake. But of course, the UK Parliament and this Parliament were desperate. There was a clamour to go to war. And so now we have a failed state of Libya, which is now a conduit being used for criminal trafficking gangs trying to bring people to Europe. We are guilty for this crisis. We are directly guilty for the drownings that are going on. I am not blind to the human suffering that we've caused in many of these countries. I would call on this Parliament, this Commission, to end the barriers to trade, to stop the fisheries policy, to ask the United Nations to get involved and to try and help. But the real question we face is, what are we to do? Are we to go down the Australian system in dealing with this crisis? And indeed, the Australian Premier, Tony Abbott, has offered us his advice and help. Australia faced this, and Australia not only have stopped the boats from coming, they've stopped people from drowning. But no, we're not interested in what the Australians have done. We have decided that we can deal with this on our own. So we've decided that people can come, and that people won't be sent back. The problem, ladies and gentlemen, is this. The definitions for who qualifies for asylum are so wide, they include not just people coming from war, not just people coming from failed states. Mr. Juncker this morning seemed to suggest that perhaps it would even include people who were fleeing poverty. I'm sorry. We simply can't accept countless millions. There is a real and genuine threat. When ISIS say they want to flood our continent with 500,000 Islamic extremists, they mean it. And there is nothing in this document that will stop those people from coming. Indeed, I fear we face a direct threat to our civilization if we allow large numbers of people from that war-torn region into Europe. I promise my party will stand up to this impending disaster for all concerned.
Well, I said that 9 days before the general election in an attempt to get a debate going. And as I said, you know, I wasn't inventing this. ISIS themselves have said they will use the migrant crisis as a means of flooding Europe with their own jihadist fighters. We've had government ministers in Libya saying that ISIS are not only making money out of trafficking the people across the Mediterranean, but are infiltrating those boats with their own fighters. Even the Jordanian minister, when David Cameron went to visit the camps, said, Mr. Cameron, be aware that at least 2% of these people are already trained, active jihadists. Ladies and gentlemen, we already, in our country, and in Belgium, and in France, and in other parts of Europe, we already have a problem. A problem caused by uncontrolled immigration. A problem caused by governments encouraging what they called multiculturalism, which meant communities living in many of these northern cities separate, entirely different lives. We've done nothing, frankly, to integrate different communities. And into that, we've seen the poison dripped in the ears of some of these young Muslim men from extremist preachers funded from Saudi Arabia and elsewhere. We already have a problem with a fifth column living in our countries that we've got to deal with. The very last thing we should be doing is opening up our doors to more such people coming in through the European Union. And this wonderful idea of the free movement of people has turned in the last few months to the free movement of Kalashnikovs, to the free movement of terrorists, and to the free movement of jihadists. If ever there was a warning that we need to have border controls and we need to have checks, it was the abomination that happened in Paris, where 3 of the 8 got back from Syria through the Greek islands posing as migrants, and where the Kalashnikov rifles that caused that death and suffering had all come from Berlin across the continent, and at no point had those cars been checked. So I think it is absolutely vital for our security in what is an increasingly dangerous world that we are not tied to completely insane EU policies. Quite what Angela Merkel thought she was doing back in July when she said, please, can limitless numbers of people come? I can only genuinely assume it was something to do with war guilt and trying to show the world how lovely the Germans now can be. But it was a mistake. It was a huge, huge mistake. And if I haven't yet convinced you the right way to vote in this referendum, just think about this. We know that Turkey has had to absorb a lot of people who've been displaced by war in Syria. And it's not actually wholly unreasonable to think that other Western countries could provide a bit of money to help Turkey look after those people. That's a reasonable, isn't it, humanitarian thing to do. But we've now finished up with the Turkish president effectively blackmailing the European Union. That's what he's done. Turkey, a country that prided itself on how secular it was, but I'm sorry to say, is now becoming itself increasingly Islamist. What the Turkish president has done, effectively, he said, give us 3 billion euros, and we'll then try and stop the flood of migrants coming to you. I thought the 3 billion euros was a one-off payment. He's now saying he wants the 3 billion euros every single year. And he's also managed, over the course of this weekend, to get the European Union to agree to visa-free access for all 75 million Turks into the Schengen area from October next year. And they are going to fast-track Turkey as a member of the European Union. Now let's just think about that for a moment. I mean, to begin with, 97% of Turkey is in Asia, not in Europe anyway. But there are 75 million people living there. Their average income is lower. They are poorer even than Romania and Bulgaria, the last 2 countries that joined. So we will be saying, as a United Kingdom, that we will give total free movement of people to 75 million poor people from Turkey. That doesn't make sense. That can't make sense. But what is perhaps even more worrying is that a recent poll showed that 8% of that 75 million actively support the aims of ISIS. So we would be literally opening up our door legally to people who want to destroy our Western way of life to come into this country, and that would be a disaster. And strategically, it would mean that our borders would then be with Syria and with Iraq. If you haven't yet been convinced that this European Union is not a good place for us democratically, is not a good place for us economically, and in terms of our security and our ability to protect our children from some of the terrors that face this world in the future, I think the decision to let Turkey join the European Union is one of complete and utter madness, and it's time to say no. I got involved in politics. I was in business before. I was in business for 20 years. And I got involved in politics because I believe that this is the most important and fundamental question politically that I will face in my lifetime. This is about our country. And frankly, what I think has happened is our political class have given away our country. They've given away our identity. They've given away our sovereignty. They've given away our pride and our self-respect. And I want my country back. And I hope you want your country back. Thank you very much.